Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Maeve Duvally, who's written a fascinating book, Maeve Rising, Coming Out Trans in Corporate America. Maeve, very good to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Diane, thank you for having me today.
You know, one of the things that struck me, you came from Goldman Sachs, and I found myself wondering, you were at the top of your career, the top of your game. If you'd been starting out in your career, do you think you would have made a different decision around coming out trans? Or talk a little bit about the context in which you felt comfortable to do this.
Sure. And I do talk to a lot of people who are in various stages of coming out, whether they already have a job or maybe they're in college and they're out in college or graduate school, but they're worried about interviewing as an out transgender person. So it's it's a very different experience. I had already been at Goldman Sachs for 15 years when I came out. I knew all the senior executives, and to some degree, that made it even scarier because everybody knew me a certain way, and they were comfortable dealing with me a certain way, and I was going to change that. But I'll tell you, there was a 7 or 8 month period where I was out in my social life, but not out in my business life. And at the beginning, the switching back and forth was kind of exhilarating. But by the
hmm
end of that period, I really felt like I didn't have a choice. For my mental health at that point in time, I needed to come out.
You mentioned in the book, you talk about alcoholism, and I'm very curious where that intersects with your decision, and you know, the role of addiction in both your own mental health and conquering that addiction, why that was important in this step.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's a central issue in the book. And it's interesting, when I first came out transgender at work and I started talking about it, I wasn't talking very publicly about my battle with alcoholism. And it got to the point where I really can't talk about my transgender transition without talking about getting sober. For me, the two are very intertwined. I've been battling alcoholism almost all my life. I only got sober in January of 2018, and I realized I had my first thought about being transgender in October of 2018, and that's no coincidence. For me, it was really, I feel, impossible to know who I really was while I was drowning myself in alcohol.
Was it basically a form of self-medication? I mean, obviously, for many people, that's what alcohol is. But talk a little bit more about when you stopped drinking, why that became sort of a moment of eureka for you about identity.
Sure. I was in a recovery program, a 12-step program, and right from the start, you begin doing kind of work on yourself, kind of cleaning house, finding out about yourself, having feelings for the first time when you didn't want to have feelings, so you were numbing it with alcohol. And after going through all that work, I just became open to realizing who I was. I think it was as simple as that.
The attention that you've had to this story, the Goldman Sachs part intrigues me. First of all, it's a a stellar brand. It's also a brand that I know has been very active with out on the street, with Lloyd Blankfein and such. But what is it about Goldman Sachs, especially coming from a communications function, that adds a luster for us where we're intrigued by people who come from that family?
Yeah, it's funny, and I've been dealing with that for years in communications. I was in corporate communications at Goldman, and my primary responsibility was dealing with reporters. And the fascination with Goldman Sachs cuts both ways. People want to write about Goldman Sachs, so when we have a story about Goldman that we want to get covered, people cover it. But the downside of that is when something bad happens, people also want to cover it. So that makes sometimes makes our life difficult. And there's just this luster surrounding Goldman Sachs. Part of it is they've retained the partnership culture. They were very secretive for so long, and they've still maintained that mystique, and that mystique intrigues people, and they want to know everything that's going on in Goldman Sachs.
And it was a company that was, I think, very much supportive of LGBTQ plus rights, and yet not an environment. And again, I don't want to, we're talking about the alcoholism. This is a very personal journey. Was that an environment where you would have not felt comfortable 5, 10 years ago making this transition? Because you talk about corporate America writ large.
Sure, that's very hard to say. I would say that despite what's happening in the United States, where transgender people are being attacked in many places, generally speaking, the way forward is positive. But what that means is every year earlier, coming out would have been more difficult. So coming out 5 years earlier than I did would have been difficult, 10 years more difficult, 15 years more difficult. And, I think I came out at a time where there were enough transgender people coming out in the workplace and being visible in other areas of society that, it wasn't that novel.
It's interesting. Early in my career, I met Jan Morris, the travel writer, who used to refer quite liberally to her time as a soldier in the war and would refer to, her male name. And then I think about the debate we had with Elliot Page, when he made that transition and whether IMDb should go back and rename all of the movies that he did. This whole debate about dead naming, because as I was looking at the back of your book, I saw these, glowing blurbs from high profile people, many of whom mentioned Michael this, Michael that. How do you feel about that? Because it's an area where I'm not sure how to act myself in terms of dead naming.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I just want to commend you for asking that question, and I want to encourage you and anybody else who has a question like that, and they have a trans person like me who's willing to answer that question, to ask it, because that's how we learn. And I think people are afraid to ask questions. You hear all this talk about the woke mob, and if you ask a question that's maybe somebody considers inappropriate, people worry that the woke mob is going to attack them. But I think we need to be educators here. And on the issue of dead naming, everybody's different. When I talk about myself to other people, I generally don't reference my previous name. It just felt right for me to do it in the book. But some transgender people don't ever want to hear any reference to their previous name. That's a part of their life that's done with. But it's different when you come out older, because if I essentially wrote off all the time that I didn't know myself, that would have been 57 years of my life. And I'm not willing to write off 57 years of my life. Some of it was very tough, but some of it was good. And that's what made me who I am today.
I am fascinated with what's happening in the country, obviously disheartened in many respects. You mentioned the woke mob. Obviously, we've had this backlash against transgender people. What do you make of it? Tell me about the reaction you've had on both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, let's start with, the left. And if that's, I hate even making that, feels like an artificial distinction, like I'm putting political labels. But have you been surprised at all by how people have reacted to the book and to you?
No, I've generally had a positive reaction, and since I've come out, my perception of the reaction around me to me has generally been good. But I have to acknowledge the fact that I'm white. I live in the Chelsea part of New York, which is kind of maybe one of the best places in the world to be out and trans.
Yeah.
And I worked at Goldman Sachs. Right now, I'm in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is a gay enclave at the tip of Cape Cod. So,
Yep.
shuttling between this bubble of Chelsea and Provincetown, those are safe places. And not every, obviously not every place in the United States is like that right now. It's actually very dangerous for trans people. And I've been fortunate that I haven't had any circumstances where I felt physically threatened, but we're seeing people in California being murdered for putting a pride flag up, and that's really scary.
What is it that you think scares people so much that we get so upset at Target putting up a pride flag or somebody choosing to live as they feel it? I mean, obviously, I'm showing my bias here, but I'm, as you've thought about what's happening around the country and you see the fear, where do you think it stems from?
Some of it comes from people who are economically disadvantaged, and and some of it comes from right-wing evangelicals who I believe. I was raised a Catholic, and the Bible they're talking about is not the Bible I'm aware of. In terms of economically disadvantaged people, you have the whole issue of globalism, and the current generation is not going to have it better than their parents' generation, and my generation, and probably your generation.
Mm-hmm.
We had it better than our parents, but there's just not enough resources to go around. So I think there's some frustration that people can't get ahead. It's hard for people, and then they see people who are different, and they want to blame people who are different for the problems that they have. And right now, we are squarely in the bullseye as people who are different.
You know, I'm always get great insights. You've had the opportunity to live as a man, to now live as a woman. Talk about that experience in terms of what has struck you, both from how people interact with you as a woman versus a man, and even your understanding and appreciation for some of the issues that women face in the workplace.
Yeah. One of the things that's surprised me in a positive way, and is something I think I yearned for all my life, is the intimacy in relationships between female friends. And I just didn't really have that before. And a lot of the relationships I have in recovery with other queer women and other friends that I have, they're very close and intimate relationships. And I really love that.
Do you have any theories
No,
as to why we're not doing better as women in terms of getting into senior roles, or from now that you have that intimacy and you see how women act, personal and professional?
sure. I honestly think that men are not doing this intentionally, but they've just created this structure that persists, that favors them. And I think companies are trying to chip away at it. I know Goldman Sachs is, and they've made progress with retaining more women and getting them to senior positions. But the structure is so ingrained, and it's been there for decades and decades and decades, and it favors the white male.
I often think we recognize excellence in a form that reminds us of ourselves. And, now as you're living as a woman, Maeve, do you find yourself seeing other women differently? I mean, you talk about the connections you have, but even when you think about women and women's issues, now that you're living it, how has it changed your perception at all?
Yes, it has. And not just with women, with anybody in an underrepresented group. LGBTQ plus people, black people, Hispanic people, Asians. I feel a lot more kinship and empathy with people in those groups, much more so than I did before. And I'll tell you, while I was at Goldman Sachs, I left about a year ago. I
Yeah.
mentored a lot of transgender people, but one thing that surprised me is once I transitioned, other people in underrepresented groups reached out to me. A black man at Goldman asked me to mentor him. That never would have happened before. And at first it really surprised me, but then it made sense. And it's not just because I've become a member of an underrepresented group. I think my attitude's changed, and the attitude that I project has changed, and that draws a different type of person to me than it did before when I was presenting male.
It also makes you more relatable and approachable too, doesn't it? To have some sort of vulnerability that you've expressed publicly. Let me finish by asking about the book, the decision to write the book, the reaction to the book. It's been out for a couple of weeks now. What are your goals in doing this?
Well, as we've talked about earlier, for
Yep.
most of my life, I was an active alcoholic. I did not have this identity, which I believe is my true identity. So for me, it's very cathartic and freeing to go back and now examine my life through this lens, which I think it's a more accurate lens to view my life. And it's interesting, there are various parts of my life that I've come to view differently. So that's why the book has value to me. I hope that it helps other transgender people. I've talked about the power of storytelling, and the
Yep.
power of storytelling is identification. One person hears another person's story, they identify, they find something that can help them, and hopefully I'll help other LGBTQ plus people. And there are people in the United States that would tell you that they don't like trans people. But so there's a certain segment of the population that's never going to accept us, never. So I don't want to waste my time on them. But I think there's a portion of the population right now that doesn't accept us because they've had no exposure to us. So hopefully some people in that category will read my book. And this, what I like to say now is some of these politicians want to delegitimize the trans experience, right? Almost like we're not real human beings. And I'll tell you, if you read my book, you will certainly come to the conclusion that my experience is a legitimate human experience.
Let me ask one other question. You've been generous with your time, but why does it resonate so much? Ron DeSantis gets up and talks about this. People talk about bathrooms. Why is it so threatening? And I confess, I understand when you talk about swimming at the highest levels and when somebody biologically transitions. I do understand some of the concerns there, but I do not understand why this particular issue just seems to get people so angry and so full of hate who might otherwise have a live and let live attitude. Do you have theories on that?
Yeah, we could talk about this for
In 30
hours.
seconds or less. Yeah.
Yeah, in 30 seconds or less. Yeah, and the funny thing is, we're really no threat to those people. All we want to do is be accepted and be allowed to live our lives as we accept those other people and let them live their lives.
Yeah.
But I think part of it might be just the weirdness factor. To many people, this just seems weird. And the problem is some of these politicians are using this as an issue to throw red meat to their political base. And I frankly think that's despicable.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, listen, congratulations on the book, Maeve. Thank you for some of your insights, and I look forward to continuing the conversation, and enjoy yourself in Provincetown, a great place.
Great. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much, Diane.